Hello, everybody. Even in the age of Donald Trump, books matter. I went to the movie last night, The Apprentice, which is about the early years of Trump. And the book ended with a fictional recreation of Trump's meeting with Tony Schwartz, who was the author of Trump's Art of the Deal, a book which in many ways made the modern Donald Trump. As it happens, my guest today, Peter Osnos, a legendary figure in New York publishing, happened to be at Random House at the time, and he was the editor of Art of the Deal. So Peter knows a thing or two about Donald Trump and the value of books. He has a new book out today, or actually next week in November, LBJ and McNamara. And Peter is joining us from his home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Peter, what do you remember about that book? I'm sure you're sick of talking about it.
Well, if it wasn't so important, I'd probably be more sick. Yeah. The one thing I said, I saw the movie. I thought it was a pretty good movie, by the way. I thought both.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent.
The Roy Cohn figure and the Trump figure really did carry the voices of the people they were playing. Two things. One is I was awfully glad that they didn't show the publisher, in addition to the person who was the ghostwriter. I was pleased about that. I was relieved. And secondly, what I say to people is the Trump that is in that book is the Trump we see today, only metastasized in a big way. All of his various qualities, mostly, in my view, now quite evil, have metastasized. I keep using as a single reference, Andrew. I happened to find myself rather improbably a year or so after the book came out at a professional wrestling event in Atlantic City. And I was there with my son and a friend. He was a teenager now, so that's why I was there. Anyway, the event had 18,000 people in the Atlantic City arena. And Trump was the promoter. And when he came in, the place went wild. This is years before The Apprentice. The only major national hit he'd had at that point was the Art of the Deal. And I remember thinking then something's going on here. And I say that Trump was already aficionados of professional wrestling then, aficionados of professional wrestling now, are where Trump finds his constituency. What is astonishing is that turns out to be roughly half the country. So that's where we are. The book was a great success on its own terms. People say, well, did he actually write it? The truth of the matter is it was written by Tony Schwartz, but it was so good in capturing the essence of Trump, rather the way the movie did last night for you, that it just was a great success and kind of forecast where we are with Donald J. Trump as we go into the election.
Yeah, I agree with you on the wrestling. I'm not sure if anyone's written a book. Someone needs to write a book specifically, exclusively on Trump and wrestling, because for me, if there is a metaphor to describe him and his audience and his approach to the world, everything is wrestling. Everything is fake. Everything is a half wink and a nod to that fakery. And at the same time, an obstinate commitment to claiming that what's actually happening is true.
Yeah, well, the thing about Trump, remarkable thing about Trump, and we can move on from Trump, is the question I ask is why? History's going to have to decide how it was possible that such a major piece of the American public, the electorate, knowing now who he is and what he does and how he operates, is still willing to vote for him. And I don't think anybody has come up with the answer. Yeah, a lot of people, there's a lot of pundits, a lot of pontification. But my view, and it's not ill-considered, is that we still don't understand the phenomenon of how Donald Trump enthralled so much of America knowing who he is. knowing what he's like, knowing what he stands for. The truth is that young Trump in the Apprentice movie and the fellow who built the Trump Tower was a legitimate figure in the sense that he came into New York and built this great big building. But he's not a legitimate figure now. His record is such that people should recognize who he is and what he represents. And somehow, for some reason, in ways we still don't understand, it hasn't happened. And that's quite extraordinary, and history is going to have to figure out how that happened.
But Peter, isn't that true of so much of history? When we look back at the past, I mean, there are so many episodes in American history, beginning with slavery, that we shake our head and think, how could anyone have accepted this as being possible? The same may be true of the background to your new book, LBJ and McNamara and America's slide into the Vietnam War. Today, we look back and think, what kind of madness overcame America that smart people like LBJ and McNamara got sucked into this absurd war? So it underlines the importance, I guess, of historians, but also underlines the fact that history is a funny thing, isn't it?
Messy. I'll tell you that what is this book, which is actually LBJ and McNamara, the Vietnam Partnership Destined to Fail. That is the full title. And the answer is, that is the point of the book, really. I am able, and we can explain why, to really describe, explain, portray what it was that enabled these two men in particular, McNamara and Johnson, to make all the wrong decisions. They knew in the mid-60s, they knew that this was not a war that could be won on conventional terms, 65, 66. And yet they couldn't figure out how to get out of it, and they went ahead. Their initial motives were, by their own measuring, honorable, to deliver democracy in the southern half of Vietnam. But they couldn't, and they didn't. And the book's purpose is to explain how that happened. So why am I qualified to do it? I'm qualified for any number of reasons. I go all the way back in Vietnam to the
you're right. You're interviewing yourself, Peter. Let me ask the questions. You answer them.
Sure.
Your background before, you're a very well-known figure in publishing. You went to Random House. You edited the Trump book. Then you went on to found Public Affairs, huge publishing house. But before all that, you were a reporter. You were a foreign correspondent, in fact, in Vietnam. So you had boots on the ground in this Vietnam thing. You weren't just a disinterested observer. Is that fair?
No, I mean, that's emphatically the case. I was in Vietnam as a reporter for the Washington Post for 2 years. I used to say that I was there on my terms, not the military's, because I was sent there by the Post.
Who sent you in the Post?
Ben Bradley. I mean, he called me in.
The legendary editor, of course,
right.
whose name now is very much associated with Watergate.
Yeah. So he simply said, I'd been at the Post for a couple of years at that point. He simply said, want to go to Vietnam. He didn't ask my politics. He didn't ask my credentials. He didn't ask my view of the war. Bradley's measurement for whether you should or shouldn't go to Vietnam was, will you get there and work very hard?
And survive. How old were you? You're about 26, 27?
26, 27, something like that. I was 26 when he asked me, 27 when I arrived.
And the story I heard is your reply was, I'll go home and pack my stuff and be ready in the morning. Is that fair?
More or less, yes. I mean,
it was an offer you couldn't, to borrow some language from The Godfather, it was an offer you couldn't really refuse.
Well, it was, yeah, you know, and in today's world, it probably would be quite different in the sense that he didn't, or he or his editors who were my immediate, bosses, They didn't scrutinize me by identity, by politics. Their single qualification was a belief that I could do the story. Energy, um,
Were your
skill,
parents
if that's
around
what
at
you
the
want to
time? Some
call it.
people might have thought you were a bit crazy to go. I mean, it was a dangerous assignment, wasn't it?
Well, you know, truth is, it didn't, better or worse, it was not something that I viewed in those terms. I viewed it strictly as a terrific opportunity um, for me, who's very, very kind of young. The war had been underway for a while, so it wasn't as it was, in the mid 60s when the first group of correspondents went there and they were forging new ground. By the time I got there, the pattern of journalism was pretty clear. I followed the pattern in the sense that I wrote about the war and the Vietnamese. I spent time in Cambodia and Laos as well. Um, and in the end, um, I was able to say that I was honest to what
Yeah,
I
I read
felt.
somewhere, Peter, and you're a legendary figure in publishing, so you've been very successful in your life. But I read somewhere that you would something that described you as a fairly undistinguished journalist. Is that fair, or is that a bit cruel?
No, no, not at all. Undistinguished. God, that's
Undistinguished in the
massive
sense that
insult. No, I had an 18-year career at the Post, which was, in variety of ways, remarkable. I mean, I got there as a kid.
but the Vietnam chapter, was that distinguished? Were you in any way remarkable as a correspondent there? Did you?
Yeah, no, I was I mean, with all due respect to whoever called me undistinguished, there were an awful lot of correspondents, and I was a good one. I wouldn't have been there as long as I was. The Post wouldn't have treated me the way they did. I actually, in connection with writing my memoir, I got my personnel file, which I'd asked for, and was actually surprised to see the strength of what they were saying about me. Look,
What was it like? I mean, I mentioned The Godfather. I recently watched Coppola's Apocalypse Now again. In fact, I watched his wife's documentary about the making of the movie. Was it as surreal as that for a correspondent like yourself working for the Post?
surreal. No, it wasn't surreal. It was real. There were real lives on the line. It was a war. By the time I got there, the uh, American military was in the process of drawing back because the thing was called Vietnamization, which was moving the Vietnamese forward. So there was less of the direct American engagement, GI engagement with the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. But I was also there for what was, by any measure, the biggest offensive of the war. 15 main force North Vietnamese divisions in the spring of '72 came crashing down. And, that was the biggest battle. Those were the biggest battles of the war. By then, people didn't really understand what was going on anymore. After Tet, people kind of said, well, it's over because the other guys are doing better. That's not what happened at all. In fact, in '72, the South Vietnamese managed at the time to hold off with American air power mostly the North Vietnamese assault. The war, Andrew, it's very simple. The United States went into a place they didn't know and understand. They didn't speak the language. They didn't really, in the end, have the kind of respect for the side that we were supporting that we should have.
Not the first or the last time, Peter, right?
No, and that really is the point of the McNamara, one of the
Yeah,
points
but
of the
before we get
McNamara-Johnson
to
project, which is
before we get to, sorry to jump in here, before we get to LBJ and McNamara, of course, by '72, the Tet Offensive, when you were in Vietnam, those guys were long gone. How do you analyze the origins? I haven't read many books about it, but I know there are arguments that ultimately the responsibility lies with Kennedy, not LBJ.
No,
What's your
no, no,
analysis of all
no,
of
no, 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 no. The book makes it up. Look, first of all, what you need to understand is, why can I write this book? I was the person who worked with McNamara for years on what was his major Vietnam memoir called In Retrospect. And in the course of that, I amassed hundreds of pages of interview transcripts in which McNamara and I engaged in what you would have to describe as a combination of journalism, scholarship, history, editing, in which McNamara told me in great detail what happened and how he and Johnson made the decisions they made. So the book is primarily a portrait of what was going on in which the years in which Robert McNamara, first for John Kennedy and then for Lyndon Johnson, was the Secretary of Defense, and therefore the person most responsible for approving, devising policies for the war. And whatever intentions they had, the choices they made were wrong. He knew they were wrong, and the record shows that Johnson knew they were wrong. Neither one of them knew how to change it, how to succeed, how to prevail, but went ahead anyway, because the consequences they believed of getting out politically and even perhaps in foreign policy were too great. So they stayed and screwed it up. Kennedy was the person who was the president who first, literally Eisenhower was probably the first, but Kennedy sent the advisors. McNamara says, and makes a very strong case, that Kennedy had announced or had decided that in 64 and 65, the US advisors would withdraw. Why? Because he believed it was the Vietnamese war and it was theirs to win. Why were the Americans there? Because of the belief in the Cold War that if we left Vietnam, that therefore it would be a communist country like China, that the dominoes would all fall. Kennedy came to understand and believe, by the time he was killed, that the South Vietnamese, who were responsible for the war themselves, probably couldn't do it. And he said that, I believe the consequences of getting out are less than the consequences of staying in. But then he was shot, killed. So then came McNamara and Johnson. For the entire first year of Johnson's presidency, which was 1964, which he called the accidental presidency, he kind of managed to stall. He wanted to be elected on his own. He was running against Barry Goldwater, who was very much of a hawk. So while all the pieces were on the board, they kept getting moved around. Johnson successfully managed to stall.
He was a good staller when, I mean, his political skills were immense. So it wasn't foreign to him to stall, was it?
Well, I mean, again, the story is that the general view was that he stalled for political reasons. I don't doubt for 1 minute that that was certainly an element. But McNamara's view was he also stalled because no one, the Joint Chiefs, McNamara, Bundy, the National Security Advisor, Dean Rusk, no one knew quite what to do. So they went round and round. And
it doesn't reflect very well. I mean, this was the Brains Trust, and I want to talk to you about your own personal impressions of McNamara, a man you knew very well. He was the creme de la creme. These days, he would end up at McKinsey after going to Harvard. He was a brainy guy. How is it that this Brains Trust, who surrounded LBJ and JFK, couldn't figure this thing out? It shouldn't have been that difficult, Peter. They made a mistake, and they should acknowledge it. What?
You know, the most famous sort of derogatory description of these guys was David Halberstam's somewhat cynical of them as the best and the brightest.
As the what? Sorry.
Best and the brightest. He wrote a very famous book.
Right. Yes.
called
Yes.
that. But he wasn't using it in a complimentary way. He was saying, how is it that the best and the brightest got it so wrong? And the answer is that they were very much products of their time. It was the Cold War. Remember, 1960 was only 15 years after the end of World War II. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. In 1961 was the Bay of Pigs catastrophe. In 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which we really came very close to a nuclear confrontation with the weapons. That was the time. And China, Red China, 1949, the Soviet Union with its bombs. There was a belief that communism was on the march, and that if Vietnam were to fall and Indochina were to fall, it would be another major part of a global communist takeover. And the United States was determined not to let that happen. And the reason they were determined not to let that happen is because that was the central strategy of those administrations, the Cold War. Hold off the Soviets, hold back the Chinese. And Vietnam was a piece of that very much larger picture.
There's the exhibit. Hey, tell me about McNamara. You said you knew him very well. What was he like?
Well, he's complicated. I mean, to say so many of us are. He's a complicated fellow. Most people made their judgments about McNamara based on his manner, his appearance, which was very sort of slick. You know, he had that hair pulled back and the glasses and so on. His presentation was extraordinarily self-confident. And I think in many respects he was. He had been worked at Ford Motor Company for years and had just been essentially promoted to be president of the Ford Motor Company when he was approached about the possibility of becoming Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration. I came to know over the years that he was a much more complicated man than his public presence, to his own chagrin. Meaning, the way he presented himself was quite different from his private or personal emotional range. And in the end, that was hard for him, very hard for him.
So what was he like privately? Tell me what his private personality was like that contrasted with what we know about him in terms of his public image.
Well, I think the way that almost any American can see a bit more of the kind of McNamara person. Well, first of all, there's a whole lot of stuff that I've got. I mean, there's a 2-hour audio that goes with the book that you can find on, well, it'll be Simon & Schuster is publishing an audio version of this book to come out in January, along with this 2-hour audio of me wrangling with McNamara on issues that were in the book. You hear him talking about what he wanted to say and how he was going to say it. This was my extraordinary ability to
he died in 2009
and help him frame what he wanted to say.
Yeah, you recorded it, Peter. Did he know? Was there any agreement that if he died, that you would publish this material?
Well, we created it all. I mean, it wasn't as though there was no one else was involved. The historian Brian Vandermark, who was working with McNamara, did all the transcription.
Okay, well, I mean, my audience, I hope, will buy the book, but they may not. So tell us about this guy. What was he like?
Well, I've just started to tell you. He was his public presence was very self-confident. His public presence was self-confident almost to a fault, meaning there was no sign or evidence in the way he presented himself that there may be any doubt. But there was. And as time went on, the doubts became stronger. and his emotional complexity on the war became. He had a family. His children at the time were in obviously young 20s. His wife Marge. They were very concerned. Concern is not the right word. They disapproved, or they were opposed in many respects, most respects, to what was going on in Vietnam, but knew that he had a role to play and that he was playing it. So there was a kind of deep family dynamic. And as time went on, the people who saw McNamara could tell the strain that the whole experience was having on him.
Should we be sympathetic, Peter? I mean, it's all very well, strains in the family, lack of self-confidence, blah, blah, but tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, perhaps even millions, were dying because of this war. Should we be sympathetic with him?
You see, that again, Andrew, the whole purpose, if this was just another book which described, the Vietnam era, then why would I bother? The whole point of this book, I say the dedication in the front is to the names on the wall, in the Vietnam Wall on the Mall, and to the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And my dedication says it did not have to happen. The point of the book is it did not have to happen, but here is why it did. And that's what makes it different. If it was just another, recounting of what happened, then it would really be, what's the point? This is from the most direct possible source, how decisions were made and why they were wrong. Did they know that what was happening was dreadful? Yes. Were they as conscious or as cognizant of the moral implications of the war as they should have been? No, not really. Although McNamara certainly, and Johnson and the others, certainly knew that a great many people were dying in a hopeless cause. You have to ask yourself, if you're a McNamara or, Johnson, by the time the war was over, was a broken man. Everybody knows that. He left office. He didn't run again. He went back to Texas. He smoked, he drank, and he died in a few years. McNamara went on to a 40-year career, first as president of the World Bank, and then as a very big, substantial advocate on behalf of all the good causes, nuclear armament control and poverty reduction and so on. He was never going to be forgiven. He knew it, and he wasn't forgiven. When we published the book in 1995, there was a tremendous uproar. How dare he write this book now when he knew what he was saying 30 years before, 20 years before? Well, the answer is that McNamara never criticized Johnson, never spoke against the war. He was the advisor to a president of the United States elected by the American people. His view and the view of others, like George Bundy, was they advised, the president decided. He said, why didn't he resign? He said, can you imagine the Secretary of Defense in the middle of a war, which he believed was going badly, resigning when there were still hundreds of thousands of American troops fighting there? To him, it was inconceivable.
You, as a younger man, I know you were a big admirer of I.F. Stone. So you're a man.
I worked for him.
So you're a man on the left, one of the great legends of American progressive thinking. Did you have qualms about going to Vietnam to report on a war, which I'm guessing you didn't?
No, I didn't have the slightest
much of either.
Let's go back to what we were talking about before. My first job in journalism was as I.F. Stone's assistant in the mid-'60s, when he was really one of the very leading voices in skepticism about the war. But these were not polemical opposition. This was opposition based on facts that he, being the kind of reporter he was able to report. The Truth is, I went to Vietnam, and the reason I think that I could do the job is that I was a reporter primarily. I'm not an ideologue. I was not an ideologue then. I'm not an ideologue now. It's a great blessing if you're a journalist to be able to see things for what they are and not through some filter of ideological devise, ideological kind of portrait that I think has become a terrible problem in American journalism. The assumption that every reporter has an agenda. My agenda was to write what I saw in a smart way, and I would like to believe that I did. I can give you examples.
Well, let me
Kind of
revise
reporting
that
that we
question,
do that.
Peter. You've put a lot of time and energy into this. As you say, you're everyone thinks of themselves as objective. You probably are more objective than many. How did the research and writing of this book, LBJ and McNamara, the Vietnam Partnership Destined to Fail, given that you knew a lot about the war anyway, you reported on it for the Washington Post, you were involved in American politics in the 60s and early 70s, how did it change some of the things that you took for granted? What surprised you? How do you think differently about Vietnam today than you did before researching and writing this book?
I think that what I was able to do with the book, and the reason why I, having been, written a great deal and been around a long time, the reason why I think this book has extra importance is that because it so clearly describes a process in which the best and the brightest made a series of choices that were wrong. The strategic and tactical decisions showed a lack of understanding of the real circumstances on the ground. And the point really is, Andrew, that exactly the same thing has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the best and smartest things ever said about the United States and Vietnam, John Paul Vant, who was the central figure in Neil Sheehan's great Bright Shining War, he said the trouble with the United States and Vietnam wasn't that we only had 10 years. We had 1 year 10 times. There was a moment in the great Ken Burns Vietnam series, third installment, I believe, in which McNamara is on the phone with Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, Secretary of Defense. Mr. President, Ho Chi Minh, the great leader of North Vietnam, why, he's been pushed aside. There's a new guy there running the show up in Hanoi, and his name is Lê, L-E, Swan, D-U-A-N. What you had there was the Secretary of Defense telling the President of the United States that the name of our principal enemy was a name he did not know and would not know how to spell. That's a kind of ignorance.
So
we've done that. We did it
right
again.
now. I take your point, and I want to end this conversation with some lessons about current American foreign policy. But I'm not sure you answered my question. I assume that none of this did this surprise you?
I don't know why you would call it surprise. I mean, I studied it, and I
No, but
concluded
you hadn't studied it as carefully. I mean, in researching this book,
I would not have. I knew when I worked with McNamara, and I knew when I was a reporter. And remember, I also edited Clark. Well, you don't need to remember. I also edited the memoirs of Clark Clifford, who was McNamara's successor as Secretary of Defense. I edited the memoirs of Anatoly Dobrinin, who was the Russian Soviet ambassador in Washington. I did a whole lot of work. I published a number of other books about Vietnam by many, many, many significant figures. I studied the war very carefully to my, part of my thing. And so when I started on this, I took all the material I had and wanted to write a relatively short, compelling narrative of how it all went wrong. And that's what the book is. How it all went wrong. What choices they made that were the wrong ones. And why?
You already knew. I mean, so nothing dramatically surprised you. I'm also intrigued by your insights on Johnson. Of course, as you say, he was broken by the war. He accomplished a great deal as a president, particularly on civil rights. Does this come in to any way the relationship between McNamara and LBJ and the other accomplishments of the Johnson administration, or is it
Well,
in parallel?
history's appraisal of the Johnson administration has evolved. His domestic policies, his domestic achievements are recognized for what they were. And Johnson, from all measuring, remember we have this extraordinary cache of all of his phone conversations, which were all taped, available online. And Robert Caro's monumental biography, which, by the way, stops essentially at Vietnam. So far, it's the next volume if he gets to finish it.
I don't know if there was an excellent conversation between Caro and Ezra Klein on the New York Times podcast, which is more about the Moses book, but touches on Johnson. So it's a particularly interesting memorial to his work.
Well, I've spent a lot of time with, I obviously, Caro's read my book. He was very interested in the material because I had material which he didn't have because he never interviewed McNamara. He never was able to go to Vietnam. He was going to go, and then COVID came, and he's too old to go. So he writing about Vietnam is writing at something of a distance, whereas he was deeply, deeply, deeply able to write about Johnson's political life and his domestic policy. I guess the point is, Andrew, that Johnson knew all there was to know about domestic policy and was very, very effective. He knew sweet Fanny Adams about foreign policy, except as it was defined at the time in the Cold War. He didn't know what he didn't know. We didn't know what we didn't know in Iraq, and we didn't know what we didn't know in Afghanistan. That is an American problem. And the relevance of the book is not just that it's a historical portrait, which obviously has merit, but it is a sense of what it is about America that makes us do these things, where we believe we're doing the right thing. It ends up being badly done because we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah. Peter, you were on the show a couple of years ago. You edited a book about George Soros, and this was just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You suggested it changed everything. Should it be a warning for some people, particularly progressives, who think that perhaps America should become more involved in Ukraine?
I think one of the things about the Ukraine war that makes it different, and particularly in context of Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, this is a European war in which the combatants on both sides are Caucasian, white. That makes it appear different to a US audience. If you're on the side of people whose language you don't speak and whose race you don't really share, you have a different approach to a war in which the Ukrainians, Russians, who we always have thought of as thugs, have been assaulted by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are people for whom we feel identification. And that makes a difference. Should we do more? I don't know if we're going to do more. I don't think there's any willingness on the part of the American public to see Americans and any numbers die in Ukraine. Think about this. Most of the wars we've had since Vietnam, total American deaths and casualties is much, much smaller than what happened in Vietnam. Total in Iraq was maybe 5,000 killed, 25,000 wounded, so whatever, I don't know the numbers. But Vietnam was 58,000 killed. We haven't done that again. Americans don't want to send GIs in great numbers, drafted, to fight in wars. So we're not going to go to Ukraine. They have very strong views on things like the Middle East and so on, but they don't involve American troops. That's a big difference.
Yeah, I was at the memorial in Washington, D.C. A couple of months ago. Obviously, the Vietnam Memorial, but also the Korean one. I don't know, remember the numbers, but an astonishing number of American troops were lost in Korea. It's interesting. What do you make of the fact that there may be North Korean troops now being used by the Russians in Ukraine, which adds perhaps to the cultural or political complexity of the struggle?
Yeah, I can't really say anything other than what I saw, which is that there are a bunch of them there, a couple thousand. I don't know that they're going to make a big difference. It's very provocative. The Chinese
Yeah,
going to be very unhappy.
it's the
So
reverse. So, Peter, finally, this new book, LBJ and McNamara, the Vietnam Partnership Destined to Fail, you've obviously put a huge amount of work into it. It's being published by Rivertown Books.
towns with an S.
River Towns. You've already put a lot of it up on your Substack page. You've got some audio material too. What's the value or point of a book in the age of Substack? Why not just put it all on Substack?
I, I've been around journalism and publishing for a very long time, and particularly in publishing for 40 years now. My approach to these things is always two lanes. One is the content of what I'm working on as an editor or a writer, and two is the means of distribution. The means of distribution have changed remarkably in the time that I've been in. We wouldn't have been having a conversation like this in any of the ways that you do it, video or podcast or anything. 20 years ago, we would have done something completely different. So by doing what I decided to do with this book, I've outgrown the need to find a huge Random House type publisher because I know what I'm doing based on my many years. Rivertown is small, independent, very good, very smart, has total distribution where I need it. Simon & Schuster has acquired the audio, which will give it that kind of center ring visibility. Point is that what I wanted to do was find the different ways in which I could reach the potential audience. So it's being made available in a variety of ways. Substack series, book now, reasonably priced, $17.95. Audio.
You've also
That
got it
should
on
cover an
Airmail.
ebook, of course. It should cover the audience. If you're interested enough, you don't have to go to a bookstore and ask for it and have them tell they don't have it. You can read it in any number of ways from any number of places. And that is what makes books different now from what they were. It used to be you could have it in any color as long as it was black. Now, in this particular case, you can have it as an ebook, an audio, you can read it in excerpts, you can read it as a print book, you can read it as an ebook. That's a very different way of publishing books.
As it happens, Peter, tomorrow I've got Stephen Reggio, who was the CEO of Barnes & Noble. He has a new book out, which he translated, Sicilian Avengers. Barnes & Noble, I think, is still the biggest retailer of books in America. Are you suggesting there's no real future of retail, that the future of book publishing will be in what you're trying to do, maybe distributing it on Substack?
No, I don't
the
feel
audio.
I think that what we come to understand, the joke I always say is that the first book in print was Gutenberg's Bible, and the second book in print was called Publishing is Dead. Publishing somehow evolves over time. 70% of the books being sold today are sold in print. 20% are sold as ebooks, and about 10% are sold as audio. Audio is the fastest growing section of the business. It's really very promising. Everybody has earbuds. Everybody has a phone. But people still overwhelmingly want the book in print. And if I write a piece and it appears online, say for the New Yorker or somebody will say, oh yeah, will it be in the magazine? In other words, there is a belief in the analog process, in print, in printed books. There's a belief in the nature of interaction with humans. that still is very strong. But the good news is there are options. You live in a small town in the Midwest and they don't have a bookstore, you can order it and have it tomorrow on Amazon. You can have it on Amazon in print tomorrow, or maybe the day after. You can have it as an ebook instantly, or you can order it as an audio and have it instantly. So if you live in a place without a major bookstore, it doesn't mean you don't have access to books. And in the most important ways that can be measured, the strength of books is their endurance as, first of all, as a phenomenon of public interest, but also that you can get them. You don't have to go look for them. They're there. All you have to do is decide which kind you want and where to get it. And that is one element of what has made the book business, publishing books, so strong. And I'm trying to take advantage of this different way of doing it while also doing the very kind of traditional thing of writing a book based on research and scholarship.
In other words, Peter Osnos, the author of LBJ and McNamara, the future of the book is good. The news on the book front is encouraging.
Yes, that's a fact. It's never going to be. It's never going to be straightforwardly just up, 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 up. It's never been that with books. It's always going to be changing and evolving. But as I said, if 20 plus years after the ebook, which was 2007, and it was really took hold, if all those years later, 70% of the books being sold are in print, and more books are being sold today than ever before.